Welcome to Explosive Enterprises, and it's time to go back to a company we featured in one of our earliest videos. If you missed the title, that's GHK, and today we're reviewing their new third generation of gas blowback AK. A lot of hopes are riding on this, as GHK's V2 AKs have historically required a fair bit of aftermarket to get working well, and since COVID have been plagued by quality control issues. I actually used to have a V2 myself, but sold it as I found it to be too much of a headache for what it brought me. Has the V3 fixed things? Well, let's find out. I should start by saying that this is a replica of the AKM, or Автомат Kalashnikova Modernizirovanny. We're not going to run through the whole history of the AK, you can find a million videos on that, but I do want to point out the significance of the AKM variant. The AKM was the Soviet Union's update to the original AK design as early as 1959, having finally ironed out the stamping process for mass production, and the Soviets built over 10 million of them in comparison to a mere 1.5 million AKs. Often when you see a so-called AK-47 in media, it's actually an AKM, which you can tell at a glance by the straighter stock, different grip style, ribbed dust cover, and slant muzzle brake. There were a bunch of other less obvious differences, but the bottom line is that the AKM is the lighter, simpler, cheaper refinement, and is the most numerous Russian AK variant in the world. Unfortunately, we do not have a real Soviet AKM to compare against. However, my wife is a fan of Comblok guns, and has graciously loaned me her SAR-1. This is a Romanian AKM derivative and primarily differs from the Soviet model in that it does not have a slant brake and does have a side rail like the later AKM-N. So, let's get right into it. Externally, the first thing I notice about the GHK is just how much steel is used in the construction. This is an almost entirely steel gun and has the classic sheen of blued steel on all the parts, which is actually a little weird because the Soviet AKMs that this is patterned off of were parkerized and then painted a satin black. So the metal looks very nice, but strays from an authentic military finish, and it's also a bit odd that seemingly every piece of steel on the gun has a slightly different finish. As for the wood, well, it's serviceable. The grain and ply are fine, and the color is reasonably close to the classic iodine red-orange, but the surface finish is paper-thin, and it scratches very easily. A few coats of polyurethane varnish would go a long ways towards improving the appearance and especially durability. Still, the whole gun has a convincing appearance and a nice heft to it, weighing in at 2.76 kilograms or 6 pounds 1 ounce without a magazine, just a bit lighter than the real thing, which is 6.8 pounds. Going piece by piece, we start at the muzzle, where GHK has replicated the classic slant brake of the AKM. The threading is not quite timed properly, however, and it required an O-ring to index in the correct location without significant wobble, which may have been intended but was not included with this gun. The flash hider is steel, and just to make it easier, unless I specifically call out a metal part as not steel, you can safely assume it's steel. Oh, and to be clear, the slant brake being angled like this is correct, as it was designed as a crude compensator for full auto fire by a right-handed shooter. The front sight base is appropriately replicated and adjusts for elevation by simply turning the post. Contrary to some arm span impaired individuals, real AK sights can in fact be adjusted for windage by drifting the front sight drum from side to side. However, despite my gentle efforts, I could not get it to budge, so we suspect it may in fact be fixed in place as it was on the V2s, despite looking like it's now adjustable. I should also mention that while the front sight base is secured by cross pins on the barrel, it is also locked in place by a grub screw on the underside, which is a concession to Airsoft manufacturing. Without this screw, the front sight has significant wobble. Moving back, we have the gas block, which does not have a grub screw and thus has a lot more play than it should. We'll come back to that. Running through the gas block is the cleaning rod, which is retained by the front sight and runs parallel to the barrel, which is finally steel after being pot metal on GHK's prior AKs. The barrel passes through the lower handguard, a wood piece with a steel retainer cap, and which is nice and tight. The gas tube with upper handguard is similarly wood and steel, and out of the box the tension spring was not sitting properly and left the gas tube loose. I should note that this tension spring was actually introduced on the AK-74 and is not accurate to an earlier AK, which we can see with comparison to our SAR, but reinstalling with the spring resting in the top groove allows it to secure the gas tube as designed. The rear sight block is cast as part of the front trunnion rather than pinned in place as on a real AK. I should mention that like the front sight and gas block, this is a cast part, giving it a distinctive grainy finish different from the smooth barrel and receiver, and this is historically inaccurate as the Soviets did not start casting parts until the 1970s. The rear sight itself is retained by a leaf spring just like the real thing, and has white paint for markings. The Cyrillic P stands for Postoyanaya, meaning constant or regular, which corresponds to a 300-meter battlefield zero, and the sight is generally left in this position for combat. On the right side of the rear sight block, the locking lever retains a gas tube, and this stays firmly in place. The left of the front trunnion bears the primary markings, though partially obscured by the dust cover, which sticks out over the markings a bit more than it should. We have the Ishmash arrow in a triangle logo, the ostensible year of manufacture, and a serial number. All the GHKs have the same 1966 date and 550910 serial, so these are cast directly into the trunnion. The front trunnion is riveted to the receiver on both sides, but note that these are hollow or tubular rivets, which are not as strong or as permanent as the solid rivets used on the real guns. The receiver itself is a simple steel box with a smooth finish as it's bent from a flat. It has divots on either side for the magazine well, these are cleanly pressed. You may notice the lack of a side rail, which was only introduced with the N variant of AKM. The top cover is also stamped like the receiver, but oddly has yet another finish with a speckled and inconsistent appearance as if the bluing did not take properly. Could be a matter of improper preparation of the part. Note also that older GHK AKs were based on AEG bodies and so had receivers and dust covers that were slightly longer than the real thing, but the V3 is finally real spec and will accept a real dust cover. On the other side, the bolt carrier is visible, again showing an anachronistic rough cast finish. The selector lever is stamped and has enough springiness to stay in position. It clicks nicely from safe to automacheski to orinochny, no wobble, no flex. The magazine catch is the typical AK thumb release style, which is secured to its housing by a roll pin that has been slightly peened on either side. This assembly is attached to the receiver with hex head screws rather than rivets as on the real AKM, but as they are on the underside of the gun they aren't particularly visible. While both the housing and the catch itself are bent sheet steel, so mag catch breakage shouldn't be a concern, but these screws were not threadlocked from the factory and started backing out under recoil, so that needed to be addressed. Trigger! It's an AK trigger. It's cast steel. It's protected by a sheet steel trigger guard. On we go. The pistol grip is cast plastic and has no identifying markings. It feels solid with no wobble or creak. It's a little disappointing that it's solid purple like the later guns rather than showing the patterns of real phenolic resin as on early AKMs, but a real grip is drop-in. And lastly, the stock is again plywood reinforced with cross pins and integrates a sling swivel and steel butt plate with a storage tube for a cleaning kit. The wood has been sloppily shaped for the butt plate, with too much material at the top and bottom and noticeable gaps on either side. This does readily interchange with the real stock with little to no modification like the pistol grip and handguard, so using real furniture is always an option. The magazine that comes with the gun has a stamped steel shell, and compared to the previous generation is a bit lighter at 541 grams versus 678 grams, and has mock feed lips, which is pretty cool. This magazine feels quite solid in the hand and looks pretty much just like the real thing. Overall, the version 3 GHK AKM is externally made of similar materials to its real counterpart and has excellent real steel compatibility. It has a few concessions to airsoft manufacturing like the hollow rivets, and the use of cast parts, the blued finish, and the tension spring on the gas tube are historically inaccurate to the mid-60s AKM it's purporting to be, but those are nitpicks that I imagine only a serious collector will be concerned with. All in all, while it would be a stretch to say it's just like the real thing, this is still very good external build quality. Except, oh boy, here we go. So if you're familiar with GHK AKs, you probably know that in recent years they've had major issues with general quality control, and unfortunately it doesn't look like anything has changed because there are significant and obvious issues with this gun that I've deliberately concealed up to this point. The front sight is canted right. The gas block is loose. The cleaning rod hole in the front handguard does not align to the retainer and puts excessive tension on the cleaning rod. The inside of the handguard itself is similarly routed offset, and we had to Dremel it to clear space for a rail mount. The rear sight is loose and canted. The entire front trunnion is canted left relative to the receiver, and also rotated left. The mag release and front shelf allow the mag to sit low in the receiver compared to the real thing, giving it space to rock side to side and front to back, and as a further nitpick, it sits at a different angle compared to its real counterpart. And yeah, I know, some of these are difficult or impossible to see on camera, but trust me, they are very noticeable in person. The receiver itself was even twisted, but that at least I was able to untwist by simply bending it with my bare hands, which is a bit alarming because although I am an unusually eloquent grade ape, even I should not be able to bend an AK receiver without leverage. It's the same 1mm thickness as the real AK, so this is just very soft steel, and I would be genuinely concerned about catching the barrel on a doorway or falling on the gun. Worse, most of the other issues cannot be fixed without major destructive alteration. Some might seem inconsequential, and I'm sure someone is going to point out that real AKs aren't perfect either, and in fact the Romanian AK we're comparing to has a canted rear sight block. But if Ivan got in a drunken stupor and made an AK this bad, he'd be at the gulag by dawn. It's one thing if a gun just looks funny and zero's a little weird, but problems like the canted front trunnion, loose gas block, and loose magazine cause functional problems on this replica, and while you may occasionally find these individual issues on real Soviet AKMs, you will never find all of them together on the same gun. Worse, this is far from an isolated incident. In the course of making this video, we've seen numerous reports from other buyers of both similar and different issues. At the time of this writing, 6 people in the Heavy Recoil Club have bought them, and all 6 have had some kind of problem. We've seen trunnion rivets coming loose, hop units shearing, nozzle stops cracking, furniture splitting, bent receivers, gross misalignment. It's a mess. And it's not like GHK is new to AKs, they've been making these for a decade now. The V3 was touted as the fix for all the legacy problems, and GHK said that their new barrel mounting system would prevent the barrel misalignment that many of the V2s showed. Well, yeah, GHK, the barrel is aligned to the front trunnion. Now what about everything else? Well, GHK has responded swiftly to these concerns by conducting a thorough investigation and determining that nobody's guns are bent, it's just slightly compressed receivers and misaligned stocks caused by the riveting process. That's, completely wrong? I don't really know what else to say to that. So while it is really nice to finally have a gas AK that's full steel out of the box, it's not as bulletproof as you might expect, and I honestly find it hard to appreciate those materials when the manufacturers executed this poorly and repair will require a considerable amount of work. It looks great, until you notice that nothing lines up like it should, and some of these problems do have functional implications. Well, let's move on to internals, starting with field stripping. First, depress the dust cover release and pull the dust cover off. I should mention that on this gun, the dust cover was excessively tight out of the box, so it required a mallet to depress the button and then had to be pried off, but it has somewhat broken in. Next, wiggle the recoil buffer out of its recess in the receiver, which can be a bit tricky. Pull the carrier all the way back, then push the nozzle all the way in from the front, and lift it out of the receiver. This is all more difficult than on a real AK or the previous V2, but fortunately it shouldn't be necessary in the field. At the front, pull up the gas tube retainer to unlock, then lift the gas tube out and pull. Work the cleaning rod out from its retainer and set aside. Flip the lever on the lower handguard retainer and pull it forwards, and then the handguard comes out the front. That's a gun field strip, so let's execute a more complete disassembly to look at individual parts. I should note that you can remove the outer barrel by knocking out this lateral pin, then unscrewing the retaining nut, but since it has to come out the back, you can't actually remove it from the gun without also removing the gas block, front sight, and muzzle device. I'm going to skip that, and instead disassemble the inner barrel within the receiver, just like the V2s. So first off, depressing this retainer tab allows the feed ramp to slide out, taking care not to lose the tab or the small piece of spring steel it sits on. An O-ring slides off the front of the hop unit, followed by the adjustment wheel, and now the 2 halves of the hop unit can be pried apart, revealing an adjustment arm and nub, and with the bucking removed, the barrel can slide out the front. First, the plastic feed ramp is pretty straightforward, but the spring under this locking tab is poorly tempered and does not spring back well. We have to rebend it a little every time we disassemble, because if the tab slips out, it will permit the entire inner barrel assembly to pull out of the outer. Also, on the feed ramp, note that the bottom is getting chewed up, we believe by unwanted contact with the magazine, which we'll demonstrate later. The chamber is also plastic, and notice the brass shavings on the locking tabs. The barrel is sustaining some amount of impact and transferring it to these tiny plastic tabs, and if they shear or deform, as they did on another owner's gun, then the inner barrel will no longer be held in place. The bucking and barrel are both GBB spec, which is a long-awaited improvement over GHK's prior use of fragile AEG buckings. The new stock bucking has a square contact patch, which is paired with a solid cylindrical nub. This is capable of applying enough tension to lift heavy BBs, but isn't amazingly consistent, which again we'll show later. Next, we move on to the receiver. The fire control group is very closely patterned off that of a real AK, and in fact is actually closer to the original than this US civilian legal AK with its import-compliant semi-auto Tapco fire control group. Pulling the trigger releases the hammer, which in semi-auto is grabbed by the disconnector when reset. Releasing the trigger drops the hammer onto the in-battery safety, aka auto sear, which when tripped then re-enables the trigger. In full auto, the disconnector is held down and disabled, so the hammer falls whenever the auto sear is tripped. The GHK also has the peculiar functionality of its stop-on-empty system, which locks the hammer down if the lever is engaged by an empty magazine. Unlike on previous generations of GHK AKs, these parts are all steel, albeit cast rather than machined. As well, instead of being retained by E-clips, they're retained by a more realistic shepherd's hook spring. I'm not going to demonstrate full fire control group takedown because frankly that shepherd's hook is a right bastard to remove, but basically you just pull it up and forwards get it off the rear pin, then extract it out the front, and then all the pins can be pushed out to the side and the parts they retain can be removed. Fortunately, since these are all steel, they will likely not need replacement. Unfortunately, the gun comes with a bare minimum of lubrication, so disassembly to properly grease up the parts may be necessary. In the recoil spring assembly, GHK now uses a 2-stage spring with a wider coil spacing at the front and smaller at the back. This means that the carrier is pushing against less spring force at the start of the cycle, allowing it to fully cycle at lower pressure, and then once the tighter coils stack up, the effective spring rate increases and soaks up more residual kinetic energy to redirect back forwards on the return stroke. This yields an increase in cyclic rate at no cost to efficiency, though it's not quite as effective as a stiff spring buffer as on the Marui or the W&S rapid fire kit, and it also softens the kick of the carrier slamming to a stop. I do want to mention though that in the course of shooting, this has repeatedly managed to disassemble itself for seemingly no reason. This does not appear to cause any functional problems when it happens, but it allows the front spring guide to slide around and makes field stripping a bit more annoying since the cap stays in the carrier. At the back of the fire control group, the V3 now accommodates 2 different recoil buffers, which control how far the carrier can travel. The longer one allows 3.5 inches of travel, while the shorter one allows 4 inches of travel, and a real AK has 5.25 inches of travel. It's not a choice between half travel or full travel, as this is often described, it's actually 2/3 or 3/4, with 3/4 being the default. The bulk carrier group is a peculiar design. Well, the carrier is relatively normal, with an aluminum piston threaded into a steel carrier, and it's nicely chunky at 393 grams, offering more reciprocating mass than most Airsoft ARs, but less than the W&S steel kit for the V2. Compared to our real carrier though, you may notice that it protrudes farther at the back. This is typical of Airsoft AKs, it's a slight elongation to provide more space for the nozzle, but I point it out because it's the reason why no gas Airsoft AK currently on the market is actually capable of full travel. Where this gets weird is the nozzle. As on the V2, there's no nozzle return spring, so the nozzle is able to slide back and forth freely, which can cause double feeds and other problems we'll talk about later. As well, the nozzle is not kept in alignment by the carrier as on most designs, rather it has wings that ride in the same channels as the bulk carrier inside the receiver, which is why the disassembly involved needing to push the nozzle back so that the wings reach disassembly cutouts. The previous GHK AKs used the same basic design, though with more fragile wings that were more prone to snapping, and it's odd to see that GHK went to the effort of simply beefing up a suboptimal design rather than addressing the underlying problem. Well, removing a screw frees the nozzle and its retaining block. Looking at the nozzle itself, GHK has finally stopped gluing them shut, so punching out 2 pins allows it to come apart. The rocket valve is this peculiar cone shape that GHK seems to like, and power can be adjusted by either filing this groove deeper to increase or filling it in to decrease. Notice also just how narrow the aperture is in the nozzle. This is narrower than on GHK's other guns, and all the gas going to blowback has to pass through this bottleneck. At the back of the nozzle, there's an O-ring and retaining clip not for sealing, but rather to buffer the nozzle when it hits the retaining block, and the main nozzle O-ring, which appears to have an inner diameter of 16mm and an outer diameter of 21mm. Note that unlike the V2s, the rear of the nozzle is not ported, so in order to seal, the O-ring needs to fit tightly, but then that can cause severe feed issues due to the lack of a return spring, which we'll get into shortly, so the O-ring is slightly undersized by design. The chamber in the carrier is rough to the touch and came severely under-lubricated. Cleaning out and then greasing the chamber before use is highly recommended. Let's move on to the magazine. First, I should say that this mag accepts about 18 grams of gas on a single fill, and holds up to 40 BBs. It's a bit difficult to load due to tight feed lips, but the GHK speed loader helps. On GHK ARs, it's common practice to file the feed lips a bit looser, but here that's a bad idea. Since the nozzle has no return spring, it's common for it to hit the BB while at least partially forwards in the carrier. If the BB strips from the feed lips too easily, the nozzle may bounce off of it and then double feed, or worse, feed the BB and then collapse into the carrier, which will force the air inside the carrier out the front and dislodge or even eject the BB out the barrel. So basically, this system relies on the resistance of the BB inside the feed lips to force the nozzle to collapse, while the nozzle has to be loose enough in the carrier to do so, and that's like... it's Honestly, I have no clever analogies. It's just a backwards way of doing things, and I'd probably tolerate it more if there were any benefit to this system. Instead, it just requires odd compromises, like the overly tight feed lips and slightly undersized nozzle O-ring, and increases the risk of parts breaking. Well, now to take the mag apart. I first slide off the base plate, which is annoyingly loose, and then unscrew a single screw. The internals can now slide out the top, and here's where I'm going to be very, very careful. The feed spring comes out as normal, but getting the follower out requires care. The reason is because the follower has a tiny tab with a tiny spring, and if those escape, I will probably never find them again. That tab exists for a fairly clever reason though. Basically, it allows the notch which engages the stop on empty mechanism to fold in as the follower travels down into the feed tube, eliminating the requirement for a cutout in the side. However, it adds significant friction, and while this hasn't caused any apparent issues yet, the magazine does feed noticeably slowly. Also, there's some bizarre damage here that I genuinely don't understand, some kind of manufacturing defect. As for the mag body itself, this is the usual GHK style of a cast block with threaded tubes used as reservoirs. The output valve is also typical of GHK, where rather than have the gas come in through the front and go up out the middle as is more typical, it has the gas come in the middle and then go out the front. A subtle difference, but this means that instead of just having 2 O-rings at the front that need to maintain seals to prevent it from leaking, all 4 of these O-rings need to stay sealed at all times. It's also fairly common for the caps on the reservoirs to leak, but these are usually easy to fix and there's no harm in permanently sealing them with gasket maker or epoxy. One last thing to note about the gas router is that, like on the V2 AKP mags, the gas router is capable of moving very slightly. In theory, this allows the router to move a bit under pressure to conform to the nozzle and produce an optimal seal, but in practice, it's so tight that it doesn't go anywhere. Overall, this isn't a bad mag by any means, but it's a bit annoying to maintain, and sloppy manufacturing means all 3 of the mags we examined leaked out of the box. Now here's where I would say that if you already have V2 mags, the differences with the V3 are minor and not worth replacing, but in testing a V2 steel mag, the router quickly got shredded with minimal use, likely due to the amount of magazine wobble. V2 PMags at least seem to be fine. With the internals of the gun reassembled, I want to point out a couple of things. First, twisting the gas block pulls on the gas tube, which if it's too far to either side will push on the piston and impart some unwanted lateral force. Second, the plastic feed ramp collar is clearly sticking out further than designed, and that's why it's getting chewed up at the base, likely as the mag grinds against it. Worse, when the bolt comes forward, it seems the plastic of the nozzle is tensioning against the plastic of the hop unit and the barrel itself. We've already seen some users report breakages as a result. Third, the trunnion misalignment within the receiver means that the left side of the nozzle strikes the hop unit first, concentrating force on that side. Fourth, when the carrier comes back during cycling, the nozzle strikes the hammer, which prevents it from fully retracting on inertia. So the nozzle will always be partially extended when it strikes the next BB during feeding, and the design outright requires tight feed lips to prevent malfunctions. I'm probably sounding purely negative right now, and that's not really my style. Credit where it's due, I'm pleased that GHK has switched to GBB spec hop parts, and now provides a steel carrier, barrel, and fire control at only a modest increase in cost over the V2. The parts that are most likely to need replacement, namely the hop and nozzle, are also fairly easy to access, plus there are the little nice-to-haves like the 2-stage recoil spring and user-configurable travel links. But that only makes it all the more baffling that the redesigned hop-up is still plastic and has obvious weak points, the new nozzle is still a weird springless design, and the stop-on-empty magazine internals and nozzle internals are largely unchanged. If you have a V2 AKM with aftermarket steel parts and an aftermarket hop, you already own a better gun than this, you probably just spent more getting it to that point. Moving on, let's review controls and operation. First off, the hop is a simple wheel that sits in the chamber. Turning left increases hop, as indicated by an arrow. This is better than needing a tool, but reaching into the action and getting a grip on that wheel is not the easiest thing, especially with gloves. Inserting a mag requires hooking the front onto the magwell and then rocking it back to lock. Here's where the construction quality proves to be an issue, because getting the mag to seat properly is fiddly. On the real AK, the magwell is tight enough to guide the magazine to the correct position and angle with minimal fuss, but on the GHK it's possible to hook in, rock back, and then oops, it didn't actually seat because it's canted to the side or not locked onto the front shelf. Even once seated, it has an excessive amount of play. Removing the mag is at least straightforward, just depress the release with the thumb and rock out. Next, the safety must be disengaged to charge the action. Middle is full auto, and all the way at the bottom is semi. Rack the charging handle, nice meaty metallic clang, and then pull the trigger, and I take back the mean things I said about the Tokyo Marui trigger because this is somehow worse. It's just a long, spongy draw that releases the hammer in there somewhere without warning. It's like an AEG trigger, except longer and heavier, though nowhere near as heavy as a real AK trigger as it breaks at a mere 2.5 pounds. I've never shot an AK that I felt had an especially good trigger, but there are degrees of bad, and the only nice thing I can say about this is that there isn't much overtravel. When the gun is empty, the hammer is blocked and the trigger is disconnected, so pulling the trigger does nothing. If you're used to how gas guns typically behave, this feels like a feed malfunction. Removing the empty mag does not enable the hammer until the charging handle is racked again to reset. Well, let's move on to shooting. That's, really weird. There's a lot of moving mass being thrown around, and I love that recoil impulse when the carrier hits the buffer, but it's sluggish in getting there with a noticeable delay between pulling the trigger and feeling the recoil. It definitely feels like it's struggling to push the carrier, which is likely the result of low gas throughput combined with high bolt carrier mass. It's loud too, but the sluggish cycle makes it sound less bang and more plop. Swapping in the 2/3 travel buffer makes the recoil a little sharper and the gun feel a little snappier, but at the cost of that feeling of moving weight. The gun still feels sluggish, and this doesn't actually speed up the action as much as you might expect, partly because it keeps the gun from taking as much advantage of the 2-stage recoil spring, and partly because it's just a pretty small difference between the two travel lengths. With most guns I have a strong preference for one or the other, but here it's either's fine. For the rest of the video, I'll be back to using the 3/4 travel, and I should note that there is no difference in efficiency. Speaking of efficiency, at room temperature and 1 shot per second, we get somewhere between 80 and 120 shots on a full mag. I say somewhere because the gun has no lockback for us to assess, but it starts to fail to fully cycle at around 80 shots. At around 100 shots, it starts to sporadically fail to pick up a BB, and soon thereafter just short strokes without feeding until it runs out of gas. In theory, this permits 2 to 3 mags worth of BBs per fill at room temperature, but cooldown is noticeable even over the first 40 shots, and practically speaking, the mag ought to be refilled every time it's reloaded. Let's try full auto. Okay, it clears 1 mag, though I really don't like how much that slowed down. We'll give it a few minutes to warm back up and try a second mag. Nah, that's not happening. In fact, it can't even clear 2 mags with fast semi-auto either. Then as far as cold weather performance, with the magazine chilled to freezing and, used with the right gun, it does not work at all, only sporadically traveling far enough to pick up a BB. This is significantly worse than the stock V2, which could reliably clear a mag at freezing. It's even worse than my old V2 with W&S steel carrier, which was actually heavier than this bulk carrier setup, but significantly more efficient at all temperatures. These behaviors suggest bad seals, and we can point to 2 culprits. It's likely that the magazine wobble is compromising the seal under recoil, and there isn't a lot we can do about that. And the nozzle, as noted, does not develop an ideal seal in the carrier and is not ported like the V2's, but a better fitting O-ring causes feed malfunctions, so again, not much we can do. Other V3 owners online are reporting the same problem, so this is not an isolated case. And I should point out that 18 grams of gas per fill is really not a lot for how much mass it's having to push, and this gun would probably benefit a lot from the use of CO2 for greater power density. But no CO2 mag was included, no V3 CO2 magazine is yet available, and frankly I'm wary about using CO2 given how many guns are already breaking on propane. On the chrono, after about 2,000 rounds of break-in, we see it goes from about 1.8 joules to 1.4 joules with .32 gram BBs over the course of the magazine, with typical stock gun shot-to-shot variance, but still with occasional spikes and dips of as much as 15 FPS. When we recorded this, there was also a peculiar reading on the second shot, and that reflects a sporadic issue we've been running into. Remember what I was saying about the nozzle needing to collapse when it hits the BB? It seems that under certain conditions it doesn't do this, instead feeding the BB and having enough contained pressure to pop the BB through the hop. That second read was from the gun firing a BB that was already halfway down the barrel when I pulled the trigger. This behavior occurs most when the mag is too full or too cold, or when the nozzle has gotten cold either from repeated shooting or just ambient temperature. I should also mention that this V2 steel magazine shows some very strange behavior on the chrono, producing higher power to start with, but also greater variance. Throw in the router damage we observed earlier, we recommend sticking to either V3 steel mags or the V2 PMags. At range, when the hop wants to cooperate, we get pretty good accuracy, but it is a bit inconsistent in amount of hop applied, which likely isn't helped by that shot-to-shot variance. It's also tough to dial it in for .32 gram BBs, having very little room between overhop and underhop, so this definitely seems to prefer heavy BBs. Well, for accuracy, at 20 yards we see a spread of a bit over 3 inches of vertical dispersion, but just over an inch of horizontal dispersion, except for 2 outliers to the right. Those are the first 2 shots, and we excluded them from analysis because as I was shooting from a stabilized position, I actually saw the rear sight leaf bounce laterally and shift the point of aim. Aside from that defect, while the horizontal spread is tight, we can see how the inconsistent power and hop causes the pattern to string vertically. This is still pretty good for a stock gun, but unfortunately it may not be possible to significantly improve further without finding a solution to its FPS inconsistency. We tried a few alternative hop setups, but none seem to improve things, so we'll leave it alone for now. That's it for performance, so let's talk practicality. Right off the bat, strong gas is outright necessary for temperatures at or below 15 Celsius or 60 Fahrenheit. Even in warmer climates, refilling after each mag will be necessary, and cooldown will rapidly become a problem if you have to keep refilling and shooting a mag, so having enough mags to cycle through and give them time to warm up is a must. As far as ergonomics, at about 3.3 kilograms, or a little under 7.5 pounds loaded, it's comparable in weight to a kitted-out AR carbine, though the full steel construction makes it more front-heavy than most Airsoft replica AKs. The 16.3-inch barrel and short stock give it a similar overall length to a typical 14.5-inch AR, while the short length of pull makes it feel more compact than it is, at the cost of making it harder for a taller shooter to tuck the stock during reloads. And reloads will take getting used to, especially if you have to fumble with the loose magwell to get the mags to lock in place. This replica will allow the classic mag-on-mag speed reload for cool guy points, but I have to say I find it a bit frustrating how much harder this is to load than any real AK I've used, as it feels very picky about getting just the right angle. Regardless, once the mag is seated, it's a piece of cake to rack it overhand, underhand, or right-handed. I should also reiterate here that when the gun is out of ammo, the trigger goes completely dead in exactly the same manner as a gas gun experiencing a feed malfunction. It may take some retraining to recognize that this means it's out of ammo, though of course if it does jam you might not realize immediately. The sight picture is serviceable with a simple notch and post. Again, the rear sight leaf having wobble makes this less effective, with 2mm of play translating to about a 15cm dispersion at 30 meters, or 6 inches at 100 feet, which could easily be the difference between a miss or a hit against an exposed head or hand. The fact that the front sight cannot be adjusted for windage further reduces the effectiveness of the irons. Sling attachment is straightforward with the stock swivel and loop on the handguard cap, though this isn't really suited for tactical use so much as carry. And as far as LBE, 7.62x39 mags are large and sharply curved, so generally do not play nice with AR-specific mag pouches, but work fine with open-top pouches or ones intended to accommodate longer 308 mags. The mags do have recessed valves, so accidentally pressing a valve is not a concern as it is on GHK AR mags. Otherwise, this is an AK, so general tips and tricks for AK ergonomics and manipulation apply, and that brings us to upgrades and aftermarket. Since the V3 now has a new hop design, new fire control, and new nozzle, none of the V2 aftermarket is relevant. As far as wish listing, we do hope that someone will offer a lightened or aluminum carrier, as that would extend the usable temperature range and improve efficiency at the cost of recoil, but nothing exists yet, so all we have to look at is real steel compatibility. I want to focus on optics mounts, as the lack of side rail rules out the most common mounting solution. There do exist sight mounts that replace the rear sight, but given the wobble of the stock sight, I wouldn't trust that to hold zero on this replica. A better option is the Ultimac gas tube, or the LCT copy of it, and this in theory should mount without modification. I say in theory because, as mentioned before, this handguard was improperly routed, and I had to remove a fair amount of material from the left side for the brackets to fit. As well, getting the Ultimac mount properly aligned is annoyingly difficult since the gas block has that unwanted side-to-side play, but at least once it's aligned and tightened down, everything stays put. Now an optic can be mounted on the rail, along with a flashlight if desired, and this gets some modern functionality on an otherwise retro gun, plus, unlike on a real AK, we don't have to worry about this setup cooking the optic. Beyond optics, if you want to go whole hog with, say, the Xenico cheese grater ensemble, that'll fit too, but really the only part of the furniture that I think really warrants replacing is the pistol grip, which is narrow and uncomfortable and strictly inferior to a modern Ishmash grip or any of the hundreds of other alternatives. But frankly, it's not the ergonomics that most concern me about this gun. While it has great external materials, real steel compatibility, and general appearance, the build quality is amateur hour and features both loose fitment and uncorrectable misalignment of key parts, and this is so significant that pointing out the incorrect finish, anachronistic elements, and mediocre furniture feels almost petty. Internally, it's an inconsistent mix of decent steel and fragile plastic. The new hop accepts standard GBB spec parts, but it's already being subjected to a destructive level of stress, and the gun still maintains the problematic springless nozzle design and the compromises necessary for it to work, on top of merely okay magazines. When it's time to shoot, it kicks like a mule and is reasonably accurate out of the box, but the action feels sluggish, it's inefficient, it's inconsistent, it has that weird issue where it ejects a BB without shooting, it has noticeable cooldown even in slow semi-auto, and chokes up in cold weather or full auto. It also has that unrealistic stop on empty, but at least GHK has announced a free upgrade to all existing owners that will enable hammer drop, which just further suggests that this was a rush job. As far as cost, $500 to $550 USD plus shipping is, well, on paper that's actually pretty reasonable for a rifle with full steel externals and partially steel internals, and is cheaper than it previously took to buy a V2 and kit it out. But if you aren't dead set on an AK, there are other steel guns at similar prices that don't eat their hop units, struggle with cooldown in temperate weather, or look like they were made on a Monday morning or Friday afternoon. And most of all, upwards of $800 for a playable loadout is a lot to swallow when it means also playing quality control roulette. Even if the QC issues are eventually fixed, it will still have significant performance limitations and inherent design flaws, so it'll be up to you how much you value steel and recoil versus reliability and efficiency, but in its current state, we simply can't recommend this gun to anyone. What's frustrating is that there are parts of this gun that I really like, and if it came out a few years ago, it would be easier to focus on its high points and overlook its shortcomings when the only alternative was WE. But Tokyo Marui now offers a gas AKM and Saiga that are more modern, reliable, performant guns, and VFC is getting in the game too with an upcoming steel AK already showing some seriously impressive demos. With strong competition from TM and a VFC on the horizon, in order to retake the throne, the V3 needed to be more than just a modest improvement. But that's all it is, an iteration that bundles together upgrades that were mostly already available as aftermarket, introduces almost as many problems as it fixes, is actually worse in some ways, and ultimately crippled by the usual poor manufacturing and non-existent quality control we've sadly come to expect from GHK. Well, that's all for today. If GHK does finally sort themselves out, we'll give the AKM another chance, and yes, we'll be reviewing the VFC AK2 when it comes out. If you enjoy this video and want to support our channel, please consider checking out our merch store link in the description. And as always, thanks for watching.